July 1965, Swanbourne, Western Australia. Captain John Murphy crouched in the scrub outside Perth, his face painted with camouflage, watching a British SAS sergeant demonstrate a tracking technique that would have seemed like witchcraft to conventional infantry. The Brit moved through the bush with an economy of movement Murphy had never witnessed in 8 years of Australian Army service. Every step calculated, every broken twig noted, every disturbance in the sand interpreted like a book. "Your blokes move like elephants," the British instructor said without malice, his Hereford accent cutting through the afternoon heat. "In Malaya, we learned that loud soldiers are dead soldiers. The jungle doesn't forgive mistakes." Murphy absorbed every word. In less than a year, men from his unit would be patrolling Vietnam's jungles, and everything depended on learning these lessons now. The Australian government had made a fateful decision 8 years earlier. In 1957, they'd created the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, modeled directly on the British SAS that had pioneered counterinsurgency warfare in the Malayan jungle. It seemed like colonial mimicry to some. To others, it was the wisest military decision Australia had made since World War II. What Murphy didn't fully grasp yet was that this wasn't just training. It was a complete reimagining of how Australians would fight wars. A transformation from conventional infantry tactics to something far more surgical, far more lethal. The British had learned their lessons in blood across Malaya's rubber plantations and jungle ridges. Now they were passing that knowledge to their Australian cousins before Vietnam consumed a generation. In the mid-1950s, Australian military leadership faced an uncomfortable reality. The Korean War had demonstrated that conventional warfare remained relevant. But conflicts in Malaya and emerging tensions in Southeast Asia suggested a different kind of war was coming. One Australia's traditional infantry wasn't prepared to fight. "We trained for set-piece battles and defensive positions," recalled Major General Kenneth Mackay, who pushed for the Australian SAS formation. What we saw in Malaya was something entirely different. Small teams operating independently, living in the jungle for weeks, conducting intelligence gathering and surgical strikes. The British SAS was revolutionizing counterinsurgency, and we were still thinking in World War II terms. The British SAS, founded by David Stirling in 1941 for desert warfare, had reinvented itself during the Malayan Emergency, 1948-1960. Operating in small four-man patrols, they'd mastered jungle warfare against communist insurgents. Their success was undeniable. They'd helped crush a determined enemy in terrain that conventional forces found impenetrable. Australian observers in Malaya sent back reports that bordered on reverence. These SAS patrols spend months in the jungle, living off minimal supplies, gathering intelligence that transforms entire operations, wrote one Australian liaison officer in 1955. They've proven that properly trained small teams can achieve what entire battalions cannot. The Australian Chiefs of Staff recognized opportunity. Britain had developed expertise through hard experience. Rather than learning those lessons through Australian blood, why not simply adopt the British model wholesale? There was some resistance, recalled Colonel David Thompson. Traditional infantry officers thought special forces were elitist nonsense. They argued we didn't have the resources to maintain such specialized units. Some called it playing dress-up with British uniforms and tactics. But the strategic calculus was compelling. Australia sat on the edge of Southeast Asia, where communist insurgencies were spreading. Indonesia's confrontation was brewing. Vietnam's situation was deteriorating. The conventional wisdom of maintaining large standing armies seemed increasingly outdated for the wars Australia would likely fight. Defense planners pointed to Korea, where Australian infantry had performed well but faced serious limitations. "We could hold ground and fight set battles," noted one planning document from 1956. But we lacked capabilities for deep reconnaissance, intelligence gathering behind enemy lines, and surgical strikes against high-value targets. The conflicts coming our way wouldn't be won by holding hills, they'd be won by controlling information and conducting operations our enemies couldn't predict or counter. The British offered more than just training. They offered a complete operational philosophy, battle-tested in actual counterinsurgency warfare. For a middle power like Australia, this was invaluable. Building such expertise from scratch would take decades and countless casualties. Adopting the British model could compress that timeline dramatically. On July 25, 1957, the Australian government officially established the first Special Air Service Company at Campbell Barracks in Swanbourne, Western Australia. The unit's very name declared its lineage. This wasn't an indigenous Australian development, but a deliberate transplantation of British military innovation. The British relationship was formalized immediately. The founding commander, Major Brian Callanan, had already trained with the British SAS at their Hereford headquarters. The British made it clear they weren't just offering advice. They were offering a partnership, Callanan later explained. They'd send their instructors to Australia, and we'd send our best officers to train in Britain and Malaya alongside active SAS squadrons. The exchange program began in 1958. Australian officers rotated through the British SAS selection course in the Brecon Beacons, the same brutal testing ground that had broken thousands of British candidates. The Brits didn't soften anything for us, recalled Captain Jim Wallace, who completed the course in 1959. We did the same forced marches across Welsh mountains carrying 55-pound packs, the same interrogation resistance training, the same jungle phase in Malaya. If anything, they pushed us harder because we were representing Australia. Those who passed brought back more than skills, they brought doctrine. The British SAS operated on principles forged through hard experience. Small patrol sizes, typically 4 men, self-sufficiency for extended operations, expertise in navigation and survival, and an emphasis on intelligence gathering over direct action. Every principle had been validated in Malayan combat. British instructors arrived in Western Australia to establish Australian SAS training programs. Sergeant Major David Ginge Fulton, a Malayan Emergency veteran with 12 confirmed kills and 200 days of continuous jungle operations, ran the first Australian patrol courses. These Aussies were good soldiers, Fulton noted in his after-action reports. Strong, tough, motivated. But they thought like World War II infantry. We had to break that mindset completely. In special operations, loud and aggressive gets you killed. Patient and invisible keeps you alive. The training regime was revolutionary for Australian forces. Conventional infantry training emphasized fire and maneuver in large units. British SAS training emphasized concealment, patience, and precision. Australian recruits learned to navigate by stars and terrain features without compasses, to observe enemy positions for days without detection, to survive on minimal rations for weeks at a time. We spent 3 weeks learning to walk quietly, remembered Trooper Michael Mick Kennedy from the 1960 selection course. Not metaphorically, literally learning how to place your feet so you made no sound in jungle undergrowth. The British instructor could hear a twig snap from 50 meters away. If you made noise, you failed that phase. The jungle warfare component was particularly intense. British instructors who'd fought in Malaya brought tactical lessons written in blood. They taught Australian soldiers how communist insurgents set ambushes, how they booby-trapped trails, how they used the jungle itself as a weapon. More importantly, they taught Australians to do the same. Live fire exercises in Australian rainforests became legendary for their realism and danger. We conducted ambush drills with live ammunition flying over our heads, recalled squadron leader Peter Harrison. The British insisted on it. They said you couldn't replicate the stress and decision-making of real combat without genuine danger. Several men were injured during training. But it was nothing compared to what would have happened if we'd learned these lessons in Vietnam. By 1960, the Australian SAS had expanded to squadron strength, roughly 120 personnel, and established a reputation for unusual excellence. When Indonesian confrontation began in 1962, Australian SAS soldiers deployed alongside British and New Zealand SAS to Borneo, conducting cross-border reconnaissance and ambush operations. This was the final phase of their education, learning from British operators in actual combat conditions. Borneo was our apprenticeship, stated Major Jack Thompson, who served in that campaign. We patrolled with British SAS teams, watched how they operated under fire, learned their techniques for border surveillance and intelligence gathering. By 1965, when Vietnam was ramping up, we weren't students anymore. We were equals. The institutional relationship deepened continuously. Australian SAS officers regularly attended British staff courses. British SAS veterans filled instructor positions at Swanbourne. Equipment, tactics, and doctrine flowed freely between the two units. When Australia developed innovations, particularly in tropical medicine and equipment adaptation, they shared them with Britain. April 1966, Nui Dat, Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam. The first Australian SAS patrol stepped off the helicopter into Vietnam's heat, carrying 8 years of British-derived training. Sergeant Bob Kearney's 4-man patrol had one mission: locate Viet Cong base camps in the Long Hai Hills without being detected. It was exactly the type of operation British SAS had perfected in Malaya. Deep reconnaissance, minimal contact, maximum intelligence. Everything the Brits taught us mattered in the first 5 minutes, Kearney later recalled. The jungle here was similar to Malaya, dense, hot, disorienting. But we'd spent years training in Australian rainforest with British instructors who'd fought in Malayan jungle. We knew how to move, how to navigate, how to interpret every sound and movement. The patrol spent 6 days in the Long Hai Hills, never detected by Viet Cong forces despite operating less than 500 meters from enemy base camps. They mapped enemy positions, identified trails and supply routes, and extracted with intelligence that enabled a battalion-level operation that destroyed 3 VC base camps. This wasn't exceptional. This became the Australian SAS standard in Vietnam. While American units often stumbled through jungle warfare with heavy casualties from ambushes and booby traps, Australian SAS patrols moved like ghosts, using every technique learned from British experience. The Americans were brave and well-equipped, but often tactically naive about jungle warfare, noted British SAS Major Peter Dickens, who observed both forces in Vietnam. The Australians approached it like we did in Malaya, patient, methodical, constantly learning from the enemy. That came directly from adopting our doctrine and training. The statistics told the story. From 1966 to 1971, Australian SAS conducted thousands of patrols in Phuoc Tuy Province, with remarkably low casualties. They killed over 500 confirmed Viet Cong, while suffering fewer than 20 men killed in action, a kill ratio that exceeded even American Special Forces. June 1966, Operation Hobart. This operation demonstrated the full application of British SAS principles to Vietnam's reality. An 8-man Australian SAS patrol, led by Lieutenant Rod Caney, was inserted to track a reported VC regiment near the Nui Thi Vai Hills. For 9 days, the patrol moved through triple canopy jungle using navigation techniques learned from British instructors. We didn't follow trails. That's how you get ambushed, Caney explained. The Brits taught us to move parallel to trails, observing them without exposing ourselves. We'd spend hours sitting absolutely still, watching a single trail junction, cataloging every person and weapon that passed. The patrol located the VC regiment, estimated its strength at 600-plus soldiers, identified the headquarters compound, and mapped supply routes. They called in artillery and airstrikes that inflicted heavy casualties before extracting without firing a shot. That's pure British SAS methodology, noted Australian military historian Dr. Peter Dennis. Small patrol, extended time behind enemy lines, intelligence gathering prioritized over direct action. It's exactly how they operated in Malaya, and the Australians absorbed it completely. The psychological impact on Viet Cong forces was profound. They'd fought Americans before, large units that moved predictably, made noise, and could be ambushed. Australian SAS was something different. They moved like tigers. One captured VC soldier told interrogators, "You never see them, never hear them. They watch you, learn your patterns. Then artillery falls from the sky. It's like fighting ghosts." February 1967, the Battle of Bin Ba. Even in conventional combat, British SAS training proved invaluable. When Australian forces encountered a large VC force in Bin Ba village, SAS-trained soldiers demonstrated battlefield awareness and tactical flexibility that conventional infantry lacked. Corporal Barry Harford's section was pinned down by VC machine gun fire in close terrain. Rather than the American approach of massive firepower, Harford applied British close-quarter battle techniques, small team maneuvers, precise fire, and infiltration tactics. His section flanked the VC position, eliminated the machine gun crew with minimal ammunition expenditure, and secured the village sector without civilian casualties. The British taught us to think like insurgents, which meant we understood how to fight them, Harford later explained. We didn't need overwhelming firepower because we understood terrain, positioning, and timing. Those are British SAS principles applied to conventional combat. The success created tension with American forces, who sometimes resented Australian tactical effectiveness. "The Aussies act like they're better than us," complained one American officer in a 1967 report. "They run these small patrols, get great results, and make it look easy." But Australian commanders knew the truth. It wasn't easy. It was 8 years of British SAS training, doctrine, and mentorship compressed into every patrol. As the war progressed, Australian SAS continued evolving their tactics while maintaining British SAS principles. They added innovations suited to Vietnam's specific conditions while preserving the core methodology learned from British instructors. In 1968, Australian SAS introduced cloverleaf reconnaissance patterns, a modification of British patrol tactics adapted for Vietnam's dense vegetation. A single 4-man patrol would move in overlapping circular patterns, covering terrain systematically while maintaining mutual support. The basic concept came from British training, explained Squadron Commander Malcolm Ray. But we refined it for Vietnam's conditions. They also pioneered helicopter insertion techniques that improved on British methods. British SAS in Malaya had used helicopters, but Vietnam's widespread helicopter availability enabled Australians to develop rapid insertion and extraction procedures that reduced exposure time during vulnerable moments. We'd coordinate with RAF pilots to practice combat insertions, fast, low, unpredictable, recalled pilot David Dunn. The SAS worked out hand signals and procedures that let us drop them into landing zones under 10 seconds from touchdown to departure. That came from British training in minimizing vulnerability applied to Vietnam's helicopter-centric operations. The Australian training team Vietnam, AATTV, which included many SAS-trained personnel, spread British SAS techniques to South Vietnamese forces. When Captain Barry Peterson trained Montagnard tribesmen in the Central Highlands, he applied British SAS principles learned at Swanbourne. I taught them exactly what British instructors taught us: patient observation, precise ambushes, living off minimal supplies, gathering intelligence before shooting, Peterson recalled. The Montagnards were natural jungle fighters, but British SAS methodology gave them structure and effectiveness they'd lacked. Meanwhile, British SAS interest in Australian operations remained strong. British liaison officers regularly visited Australian SAS positions, and information exchange continued throughout the war. When Australians developed effective counter-tracking techniques against VC trackers, they shared them with British SAS, who applied them in future operations. The relationship evolved from student-teacher to genuine partnership. By 1969, we were equals, noted British SAS Major Jim Vakatali, who served as liaison officer. The Australians had taken our doctrine, applied it brilliantly in Vietnam, and developed innovations we studied and adopted. It became a true two-way relationship. By 1970, Australian SAS had achieved a level of effectiveness that impressed even hardened British SAS veterans. Reconnaissance patrols routinely spent 2 to 3 weeks deep in enemy territory, gathering intelligence that shaped entire division-level operations. Operation Marsden in August 1970 showcased peak capability. A single Australian SAS patrol tracked a VC battalion for 19 days through Phuoc Tuy province, mapping their positions, routines, and supply routes without ever being detected. The intelligence enabled a coordinated assault that shattered the VC battalion with minimal Australian casualties. That operation represented everything British SAS stands for, commented Lieutenant Colonel Dare Wilson of the British SAS. Patience, discipline, intelligence over firepower. The Australians had absolutely mastered our methodology. The psychological warfare element, another British SAS specialty, reached sophisticated heights. Australian SAS would deliberately leave subtle signs of their presence near VC camps: cigarette butts from Australian brands, empty ration tins, boot prints in distinctive patterns. VC forces knew they were being watched, but couldn't determine when or where attacks would come. Australian casualties remained remarkably low, even as operational tempo increased. The British SAS derived emphasis on training, planning, and tactical discipline paid continuous dividends. Every patrol had a detailed brief, multiple contingency plans, and clear exfiltration procedures, explained Warrant Officer Keith Payne. That came directly from British SAS operational planning methods we'd adopted wholesale. The Australian SAS's Vietnam performance validated the decision to adopt British SAS methodology. From 1966 to 1971, they conducted over 1,200 patrols with kill ratios exceeding 20.1 and reconnaissance success rates above 90%, statistics that exceeded most American Special Forces units. The British gave us a 10-year head start on jungle warfare expertise, reflected Major General Tim Fisher, who served with Australian forces in Vietnam. Without that foundational training and doctrine, we would have learned those lessons the hard way, through casualties and failure. The relationship between British and Australian SAS remained strong post-Vietnam. Cross-training continued, joint operations occurred in subsequent conflicts, and doctrinal exchange never ceased. When Australian SAS fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, British SAS tactics and principles remained embedded in their DNA. British SAS veteran Andy McNabb later noted, "The Australians took what we learned in Malaya, perfected it in Vietnam, and proved that small, well-trained teams using proper special operations principles can achieve strategic effects. They validated everything we believed about how special forces should operate." In the end, Australia's decision to model their special forces on British SAS wasn't colonial mimicry. It was strategic wisdom. They imported battle-tested expertise, adapted it to their needs, and created one of the world's most effective special operations forces. The partnership, begun in 1957, saved Australian lives in Vietnam and shaped their military effectiveness for generations to come.